They found Evelyn at sunrise, standing barefoot in the frost-tipped weeds behind her family's farmhouse. Her nightgown was torn, her hair tangled with pine needles, her hands scraped raw as if she had crawled through half the forest. The deputies called her name, but she didn't look at them. She just stared at the house, quiet, hollow, and wrong, like she was afraid it might breathe again. When they finally approached, she whispered a sentence so faint they almost missed it. And when they asked where her family was, she only shook her head once, slowly, as if the truth still clung to her like the cold. Inside, the silence felt thick enough to choke on. Breakfast plates sat untouched, chairs knocked over, a lamp still flickering though no one had touched it in hours. The sheriff moved carefully, muttering to himself, because the air felt charged, like a secret was waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to disturb it. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned under each step. Something had happened in that house during the night, something that didn't match the stillness they were walking through. And Evelyn, sitting alone on the back porch under a sheriff's blanket, kept her eyes on the attic window with a terror that rooted her to the spot. Evelyn wasn't known for causing trouble. She was quiet, obedient, the kind of girl who apologized before she'd even done something wrong. But yesterday, her mother had called the pastor, her father had dusted off the old family Bible, and her cousin, the man she was meant to marry, had moved into the guest room. The house had been filled with forced laughter, tense prayers, and the metallic scent of old arguments. Evelyn hadn't smiled once. Anyone watching closely would have seen the dread in her eyes when the elders spoke of keeping tradition alive, when her cousin placed his hand on her shoulder a little too firmly, when her parents locked the front door as if they expected her to run. No one knew that, sometime after midnight, Evelyn had climbed the stairs alone, the hall lit only by the flicker of a dying bulb. No one heard the first scream. No one heard the second. And no one, not even Evelyn herself, could later explain what finally snapped inside her once she reached that attic door, the one her family had warned her never to open. All she remembered was the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, the sound of distant whispers urging her to obey, and the cold certainty that if she didn't fight her way out, she would lose herself forever. By the time the sheriff stepped back outside, pale and sweating, he kept his distance from her. Evelyn still hadn't moved. Her breath fogged gently in the morning air, but her eyes remained locked on the house, unblinking, haunted. It was only when he touched her shoulder that she finally turned toward him, her voice cracking like old wood as she whispered, "I told them I wouldn't marry him. I told them. But they wouldn't let me leave, and something in that room wouldn't let them either." Key point number 1 expanded into approximately 450 words, with asterisk asterisk no subheadings asterisk asterisk and asterisk asterisk no ending sentence asterisk asterisk. The search party had been out since before dawn, their boots crunching through the thin layer of frost that coated the pines, their breath drifting in pale clouds as they called Evelyn's name into the cold, hollow silence. The woods behind the farmhouse were dense, older than the roads and fences that surrounded them, and the locals often said the trees seemed to hold sound rather than let it pass. That morning, every snapped twig, every rustle of branches felt amplified, as if the forest itself was paying attention. The sheriff led the group, flashlight in hand though the sun was already rising, because habit told him to be ready for anything. He expected to find footprints, maybe torn fabric caught on a branch, maybe nothing at all. What he didn't expect was to see the girl standing there as though she had grown out of the ground overnight. Evelyn emerged from between the pines slowly, her white nightgown stained with mud and something darker, her bare feet blue from the cold. She didn't seem to notice the searchers at first. Her eyes were fixed on the distant outline of her family home, visible through the thinning fog like a memory refusing to fade. She swayed slightly, as if the weight of the night was still pressing down on her, as if she was afraid that taking one wrong breath might cause everything around her to collapse. When the sheriff called her name, she didn't flinch. Only when he moved closer did she blink, almost surprised to see another human being standing in front of her. The deputies asked where she had been, what had happened, whether she was hurt. Evelyn opened her mouth once, then closed it again, like a child unsure whether speaking would make things worse. Her hands trembled violently, fingers smeared with dirt beneath the nails, suggesting she had crawled rather than walked through the woods. When the sheriff reached out to steady her, she whispered something so faint that he thought he imagined it. Her voice cracked, raw from cold and fear, But her eyes held something far more unsettling, a hollowed-out stare that made the men around her shift uncomfortably, as if they were standing beside someone who had seen something they were never meant to understand. The forest behind her was silent in a way that didn't feel natural, as though it were holding its breath. And Evelyn, with that distant look frozen on her face, seemed like someone who had stepped out of a nightmare but hadn't fully returned from it yet. Evelyn had always known her family's expectations would eventually tighten around her like a rope, but she never imagined they would do it so abruptly, without warning, without even pretending to care what she wanted. The announcement came on a humid evening, the kind where the air felt heavy and the cicadas screamed loud enough to drown out a person's thoughts. Her mother stood at the kitchen table smoothing the creases of a floral tablecloth that didn't need smoothing, her father staring at the floor as if reading words only he could see. They didn't ease into the conversation or soften it with gentle explanations. Her mother simply said that Evelyn's cousin would be moving in for a short while, said that the wedding arrangements would begin as soon as possible, said that this was the way things needed to be, the way things had always been. Evelyn felt her throat close when she heard it. Her cousin. The one who had always watched her too intently during family gatherings. The one who stood too close, spoke too softly, smiled without warmth. She had always avoided him, brushing off her discomfort as childish paranoia, but now that discomfort swelled into something sharp and unbearable. She tried to protest, stumbling over her words as she tried to explain that she wasn't ready, that she didn't love him, that she didn't want any of this. Her father's expression hardened instantly. He spoke with the finality of someone reading a sentence rather than delivering news. This wasn't about love or readiness, he said. This was about duty, about keeping kin close, about preserving what their family believed in. Her mother's eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt or fear, but she said nothing. Instead, she moved to Evelyn's side and gently brushed the hair from her face, the gesture almost tender, but her voice carried the edge of someone forcing calm where none existed. "It's for the best," she whispered, as if whispering made the lie easier to accept. Evelyn felt the room closing in, the walls narrowing, the air thickening until breathing became an effort. She tried again to argue, but every reason she offered was dismissed, minimized, or ignored entirely. Her parents refused to hear her, refused to look at her in a way that acknowledged her as someone with her own future rather than a piece of a long-standing arrangement they were determined to uphold. By the end of the night, her fate had been sealed without her consent, her voice swallowed by tradition and fear. She sat alone in her room, hands clenched in her lap, listening to the quiet murmur of her parents discussing wedding dates in the next room, their words drifting through the thin walls like the slow tightening of chains she could not break. Evelyn had grown up hearing fragments of old stories, whispered warnings from distant relatives about rituals that once guided the family's choices, but they had always felt like relics, strange traditions buried in dusty trunks or murmured only by elders who lived more in the past than the present. She never imagined any of it mattered anymore. But when her cousin arrived for the engagement her parents insisted upon, she realized those stories had teeth, and he carried them with an unsettling reverence. From the moment he stepped through the door, he behaved not like a groom-to-be, but like someone fulfilling a sacred duty, one that made him watch Evelyn with the solemn intensity of a priest regarding an altar. He spoke little during meals, but when he did, he referenced the family's lineage, purity, and continuity with a conviction that chilled her. He acted as though the marriage had been written for them long before either of them was born, carved into the bones of their ancestors. Evelyn tried to avoid being alone with him, but the house was small and her parents encouraged their time together, insisting they needed to build understanding. He would corner her in quiet hallways with his soft, deliberate voice, describing old customs she'd never heard explained so plainly. He told her about vows older than the church, ceremonies once held in secret under moonlight, promises intended to bind not just husband and wife, but entire generations. He spoke of ancestors who believed their blood held a unique strength, one that needed to be protected and reinforced. There was devotion in the way he described it all, devotion that bordered on worship, and the intensity in his eyes made her feel like an object he had already claimed. One night, while she pretended to read in the living room, he sat across from her and spoke of something he called the purity rite, a ritual he claimed their family had abandoned only because outsiders would never understand it. His voice grew hushed, almost reverent, as he explained that certain traditions were meant to keep a family whole, untouched, unbroken by outside influence. He made it sound like an honor, a legacy she should feel privileged to uphold, but the way he described it, the secrecy, the rigidity, the absolute obedience it demanded, made Evelyn's skin crawl. When she asked where he learned all this, he simply smiled in a way that made her stomach twist and said their grandmother had taught him everything before she died, passing down knowledge meant for those strong enough to carry it. In that moment, Evelyn realized he didn't just accept the arranged marriage, he believed in it. He believed it was necessary, ordained, and sacred. And the certainty in his voice made her understand that he wouldn't let her refuse, because in his mind, this wasn't a choice at all, it was destiny, and he was determined to fulfill it, no matter what she wanted. The house had always felt old in a way Evelyn couldn't quite describe, as if it carried the weight of more memories than a single family could ever accumulate. But she had never felt truly unsettled by it until the days leading up to the forced wedding. Her cousin's arrival seemed to shift something in the air, making each hallway feel narrower, each creaking floorboard louder, each shadow a little too still. It was during one of those heavy, silent afternoons, while her mother was busy sewing and her father was talking in hushed tones with her cousin, that Evelyn found herself drawn toward the attic staircase, a place she'd been warned to avoid since childhood. Her parents always said it was filled with clutter and dust, but their eyes had held a flicker of something like fear whenever they said it. Curiosity mingled with dread as she climbed the narrow steps, the wooden boards complaining under her weight. The door at the top stuck for a moment before giving way with a slow, reluctant sigh, releasing a stale breath of cold air that seemed untouched by time. Inside, the attic was dim, lit only by a small window whose glass was fogged by years of neglect. Dust floated in the faint light, moving like tiny spirits drifting through the stillness. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary storage space, old trunks stacked haphazardly, moth-eaten blankets, boxes of forgotten belongings. But as Evelyn moved deeper, she noticed the oddity of the arrangement. The objects weren't placed randomly. They felt curated, almost arranged. The trunks were lined up in deliberate rows, and the portraits leaning against the far wall faced inward, as though turned away from anyone entering. Her breath hitched when she realized the portraits had eyes scratched out, every face, every ancestor, every family figure defaced with unsettling precision. Some scratches were faint, as if made hesitantly, others were deep and violent, tearing into the wood frame like claw marks. She crouched to examine them, a chill crawling up her spine. Who had done this? And why hide them here? Her hands trembled as she opened one of the trunks, half expecting something to jump out. Instead, she found journals, old leather-bound books filled with cramped handwriting and brittle pages. The entries were disturbing, describing rituals, obedience, purity, and warnings about disobedient daughters who forgot their place. Some passages hinted at punishments carried out in secret, all in the name of tradition. One journal mentioned the purity rite her cousin had spoken of, but in a tone that suggested fear rather than reverence. Evelyn snapped the book shut, heart pounding, realizing with a clarity that made her stomach twist that her family's traditions were not harmless relics. They were rules enforced, controlled, and protected through generations. And by arranging her marriage, by pushing her toward a man who worshipped these rituals, her family was preparing her to become part of something far older and darker than she had ever imagined. The first whisper came late at night, soft enough that Evelyn thought it was merely the wind pressing against the siding of the old house. She was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to banish the memory of the attic and the journals filled with warnings she didn't understand. The house creaked the way it always had, settling into itself like an old man shifting in his sleep. But beneath the familiar sounds, something else stirred, faint, deliberate, almost questioning. She sat up slowly, holding her breath. The whisper came again, threading itself through the stillness like a thin ribbon of sound, too low to make out words, yet unmistakably shaped like human speech. It slipped through the darkness near her door, brushing her ears like a cold breath. For a moment she wondered if her cousin was lingering outside her room, listening, waiting, but when she called out softly, no footsteps followed, no shadow shifted behind the crack under her door. She tried to convince herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her, the remnants of fear after discovering the unsettling things hidden in the attic. But as she lay back down, the whisper returned, closer this time, as though it was inside the room with her. It wasn't threatening at first, just insistent, like someone trying to tell her something urgent but forbidden. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the blanket, telling herself she was imagining it. Yet the sound followed her into sleep, and when she jolted awake hours later, heart racing, she swore she felt the whisper drift across her skin like a passing fingertip. The next day, the voices didn't stop. They hid themselves in the clatter of dishes, in the hum of the old refrigerator, in the sigh of the floorboards. Sometimes they urged her to run, to get out while she still could. Other times, they told her to obey, to accept her place, to honor the traditions she'd been born into. The conflict in their tone left her unsettled, unsure whether they wanted to help her or break her. When she was alone, they were louder, never enough to form full sentences, but clear enough to feel intentional. She avoided telling her parents or cousin, fearing they'd call her hysterical or use her fear to tighten their control over her. Instead, she kept the growing dread inside her, pretending everything was normal even as the whispers grew bolder. One evening, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair with trembling hands, the whispers suddenly merged into one unmistakable command: don't disobey. The force of it made her gasp, dropping the brush onto the tiled floor. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale and unfamiliar, her eyes wide with terror as another whisper slid through the silence, gentler this time, almost mournful, as if warning her of the consequences yet to come. The night before the wedding felt heavier than any Evelyn had ever lived through, thick with the kind of tension that makes even the walls seem to listen. Dinner had been silent except for the clinking of cutlery against plates, each sound sharp enough to make her flinch. Her parents exchanged glances she couldn't decipher: fear, determination, maybe guilt, but none of them addressed the growing panic in her eyes. Her cousin sat rigidly at the end of the table, watching her with that same unsettling devotion, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the wood, as though counting down to something only he understood. When Evelyn pushed her food away and asked to be excused, her father's jaw tightened, and her mother hesitated before nodding. It felt less like permission and more like a momentary delay of something inevitable. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her and pacing in frantic circles as the whispers she had tried to ignore all day flickered at the edges of her mind. Some urged her to flee, to run into the night and keep running until the house was only a distant memory. Others hissed warnings about duty, tradition, and the punishment that awaited defiance. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices were inside, woven into the very air of the old house. Every instinct screamed at her to escape, yet dread rooted her to the floor. She knew that if she tried to run, her parents would follow. They would drag her back. They had made that painfully clear. Her door handle rattled once, then her mother's voice came through, unusually stern despite the tremor in it. "Come downstairs, Evelyn. Now." The command carried no room for refusal. When she unlocked the door, she found both her parents waiting in the hallway, their expressions hollow. They guided her, more like herded her, toward the living room, where her cousin stood near the fireplace, the flames casting long, wavering shadows that made the room feel alive. Her father closed the door behind them, the click of the latch echoing like a verdict. Her mother spoke first, explaining in a trembling voice that Evelyn needed to accept her fate, that running or resisting would only bring disgrace and danger upon them all. Her father's tone was colder, stripped of softness. He called her fear childish, her objections foolish, her reluctance selfish. He insisted she stop embarrassing the family, reminding her of the vows she would take at dawn whether she liked it or not. Her cousin stepped closer, his expression tightening with something darker than impatience. He placed a hand on her shoulder, gripping too firmly, promising he would guide her through the responsibilities she seemed unwilling to embrace. In that suffocating moment, Evelyn realized with sudden clarity that her parents weren't just expecting obedience, they were demanding it, fully prepared to force it if necessary. Their fear of breaking tradition outweighed their love for her, and their determination to control her left her standing in a room where every exit felt sealed, every ally gone, and every hope of freedom fading like the last embers in the fireplace. The moment that finally broke Evelyn didn't arrive with a scream or a sudden burst of violence. It came quietly, slipping into her like a cold blade, the kind that doesn't bleed until long after it cuts. After her parents cornered her in the living room, after her cousin's hand tightened on her shoulder with a possessive certainty that made her stomach twist, she felt something inside her begin to splinter. It was a feeling she couldn't name, a hollowing out that left her barely able to breathe. Her parents kept talking about duty, about family, about the expectations she was born into, but their voices sounded distant, warped, as though echoing from the bottom of a well. She stared at the floorboards while their words washed over her, each one a reminder that her life was no longer hers. The realization settled heavily on her chest, suffocating and irreversible. Her cousin's voice was the one that pushed her over the edge. Calm, steady, disturbingly proud, he spoke about the purity right again, telling her she would come to understand it once she accepted her role. His hand slid from her shoulder to her wrist, gripping with a firmness that hinted he had already decided she belonged to him. He spoke of unity, of bloodlines, of sacred obligations passed down through generations. The longer he talked, the more Evelyn felt her mind recoil, as though a part of her was trying to break free from the tightening grip of despair. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out his words until all she could hear was the rapid, frantic beating of her own heart. When she tried to pull away, her father stepped forward, his expression darkening in a way she had never seen before. He ordered her to stop resisting, reminding her that she was not a child anymore. Her mother stood behind him, wringing her hands, eyes glassy with fear, not fear for Evelyn, but fear of what her disobedience might unleash on the family. That was the moment Evelyn realized she was truly alone, that no one in the room saw her as anything more than a vessel for tradition. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air pressing against her chest until she could barely inhale. Her cousin reached for her again, and something sharp and electric snapped inside her. It wasn't rage at first, just terror, pure and primal, a desperate instinct for survival that surged through her like a shock. Her breath came out in a ragged gasp, and for a moment everything around her blurred. The whispers that had haunted her for days rose suddenly, swelling into a cacophony that filled her head with overlapping commands, pleas, warnings. Some urged her to fight. Others told her to surrender. But one voice rose above the rest, clear and fierce, telling her that if she didn't break free now, she never would. In that instant, Evelyn felt the world tilt. Something inside her, the last fragile piece that had kept her obedient her whole life, fractured beyond repair. The night of the storm arrived like a living thing, slamming into the farmhouse with a fury that made the windows shiver and the roof groan under the weight of the wind. Rain lashed against the sides of the house in relentless sheets, turning the dirt yard into a mire of mud and puddles that reflected the lightning in jagged, momentary shards. The air smelled of wet pine and something metallic that made Evelyn's stomach churn. Inside, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in as the storm's noise blended with the tense silence of the family. Her parents' voices had grown sharper throughout the evening, clipped commands and low, urgent whispers that Evelyn could barely decipher. Her cousin remained calm, unnervingly so, his presence looming over her with the quiet menace of someone who believes in fate more than mercy. By the time midnight crept past the clock on the wall, the tension reached a breaking point. Her parents cornered her once again, this time in the dimly lit hallway that led to her room. The lamps flickered with each gust of wind, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the walls. Her mother's hands shook as she tried to restrain Evelyn, while her father's grip on her arm was firm and unyielding, a physical representation of the weight of tradition pressing down on her. Her cousin moved closer, whispering something about the responsibility of blood in a tone that was almost intimate, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Evelyn felt trapped between them as if the house itself had joined forces to hold her in place. Panic surged through her, a wild, uncontainable current that left her shaking and gasping. Something in her snapped, a primal instinct that overrode fear, obedience, and reason. She lashed out, using every ounce of strength she had, fueled by sheer survival instinct. The scuffle escalated quickly, bodies crashing against walls, furniture overturning, glass shattering under the force of the chaos. Her scream pierced the storm outside, a raw, animal sound that seemed to echo through the trees, swallowed by the torrential rain. The storm itself seemed to conspire with her, masking the noises, drowning out the chaos, until the house became a chamber of clashing shadows and frantic movement. Blood mixed with rainwater that seeped in through the cracks around the windows, pooling on the wooden floors as the struggle continued. The metallic scent of fear and violence filled the rooms, mingling with the smell of damp wood and wet pine. Outside, Neighbors would later remember that the snow, or the mixture of ice and rain, looked almost red in the stormlight, as if the night itself had bled alongside the family. Evelyn moved through the house like a force she barely recognized, each step both an act of terror and defiance, and by the time the night was spent, the farmhouse felt transformed, hollowed out by the violence and drenched in the storm's fury. Evelyn didn't pause to look back as she fled into the forest, her bare feet sinking into the wet, tangled underbrush, each step sending sharp pricks of pain up her ankles. The rain had softened the earth, making her progress slow, but she barely noticed. Every sound, the snapping of twigs, the rush of wind through the pines, the distant roll of thunder, was magnified, setting her nerves on edge as she ran without direction. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, and her hair clung wet and heavy to her face, but she kept moving because stopping meant facing them again, facing the suffocating weight of tradition and expectation she could no longer bear. Shadows stretched across the forest floor like long, reaching fingers, and in her terror, she imagined shapes moving with her, chasing her, whispering in voices that weren't entirely human. The moon broke through the storm in thin, intermittent beams, illuminating patches of the forest in pale silver that seemed to twist and distort the trees. Evelyn stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped her hands on bark, and fell once, landing in a shallow puddle that soaked her nightgown. Her chest heaved as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the fabric to her knees, the chill biting through her skin. Somewhere behind her, a sound echoed, footsteps. Whispers. She couldn't tell, but the forest seemed alive with pursuit. Every instinct screamed that they were close, that her parents and cousin were hunting her, and perhaps something else, older and darker, lingered among the trees, watching, waiting. The fear pressed on her mind with a crushing weight, but it also sharpened her senses, forcing her to move with a speed and precision she didn't know she possessed. Branches lashed at her face, thorns tore at her arms, and yet Evelyn didn't slow. She knew that if she stopped, even for a moment, she might never escape. The whispers from earlier in the house returned, but in the forest they were different, less insistent, more distant, almost guiding her along a path she could not see. She didn't understand if they were real or just fragments of her fraying sanity, but she obeyed them instinctively, turning left at a fork, vaulting over a fallen log, slipping through a narrow passage between two closely set pines. Hours seemed to pass, though she had no sense of time, and the storm gradually softened, leaving a damp, misty forest that smelled of wet pine and cold earth. Evelyn's legs were numb, her body trembling from exhaustion, yet she continued moving, propelled by an unrelenting need to survive. The woods, dense and oppressive, seemed endless, but somewhere in the distance, she glimpsed a faint light, fragile against the darkness, and for the first time since she had fled the house, a flicker of hope sparked in her chest. By the time the authorities managed to get Evelyn into the interrogation room, she was a shadow of the girl who had walked barefoot from the forest. Her clothes were torn, hair matted, and her skin pale from cold and shock. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear, a sterile contrast to the chaos she had left behind. The officers tried to ask questions, their voices careful but insistent, hoping for details about her family, the events in the house, anything that would explain what had happened. Evelyn sat stiffly in the chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes wide but distant, as if watching something beyond the walls of that small, fluorescent-lit room. She didn't respond at first, only stared, trembling slightly, until the lead investigator leaned forward and asked her again. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible, but when she spoke, it carried a weight that made the room fall into an uneasy silence. Evelyn described the house with a precision that was almost clinical, recounting the layout of rooms, the placement of furniture, the way shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in the corners. She spoke of the attic and the journals she had found, of the traditions and rituals her cousin had demanded she honor, and of the whispers that had guided and tormented her in equal measure. Every word seemed rehearsed, yet raw, tinged with the tremor of a mind that had endured too much in too little time. The investigators exchanged glances, some skeptical, some disturbed, unsure whether they were listening to the testimony of a traumatized teenager or a young woman who had glimpsed something the rest of the world could not see. When they asked why she had done what she did, Evelyn's eyes darkened in a way that made them all uneasy. She whispered that she had no choice, that the house had demanded obedience, and that the rituals her cousin followed were older and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. She recounted how the purity rite had loomed over every interaction, how her parents had pressured her into submission, and how the voices, sometimes guiding, sometimes threatening, had pushed her toward decisions that she barely understood in the moment. She described the moment when fear and survival converged into a single instinct, the moment when resistance became not just necessary but unavoidable. Her words were deliberate, haunting, as if speaking them aloud allowed her to release only part of the terror that had taken root inside her. The officers pressed for more, asking for names, dates, details of the night, but Evelyn only shook her head, murmuring that some things could not be spoken aloud. Her lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the corner of the room as though she could see the shadows of that night lingering there still. She allowed a small, shuddering breath, hinting at the horrors she had survived, and in that fragile moment, she revealed the unspoken truth, that something else older, unseen, and perhaps not entirely human, had been in the house, watching, waiting, influencing the events that no one could fully explain.